So we'll get started. So Sukka Hamidu V'lalas. There's a question in the Gemara what a Sukka Hamidu V'lalas is. So on Chavpei Samad Aleph, all at the top. Sukka Hamidu V'lalas. A Sukka that's Midu V'lalas. The Gemara is going to explain what exactly this is. Vishitzilsa Meruba Mechamta, or a Sukka that has more shade than Tzan Ksher, it's kosher. The Gemara is going to have a question as to what Midu V'lalas means, A, and B is that connected to this? And it's one case that even though it's midav lalas, it still is still some rub mechamta, or is it two separate things? The sukkah midav lalas is kosher, and the tilta meruba mechamta is kosher. And we'll see in the Gemara what this means. Hamauba kamin bayis. What if the schach is so thick, it's almost like it's a ceiling of a house? Even though you can't see any stars through it, it's still kosher. So you see, there seems to be no limitation as to how thick the schach should be. And that's going to be a matter of dispute. My miduvlalas. What does miduvlalas mean? Omarav sukkaniya. It means that there's not enough schach in some areas. Let's see Rashi. Aniya. It doesn't have enough schach. Because of that, the yesh ba'ave harbe, there's a lot of air. There's no air gap of 3 tfachim. So that's the first trap. And Shmuel Amar Kana Oila B'Kaniyah. And Rashi says, Shalahishva Haschach Lahashva Kanin Zaitzalzeh. You don't have one layer of schach that goes across the whole sukkah. You have, let's say, 3 inches of schach that's right on top of the sukkah, and then there's another layer of schach that's maybe 6 inches higher, and then you have another 3 inches of schach, and then down again you have 3 inches of schach, and then up again. Because of that, because they're not all in one plane, if the sun is coming in at an angle, so now if the sun's coming in at an angle, the sun's going to get right through the schach. The Mishnah teaches the Chiddush, that meaning you say, when do you make the judgment call as to whether the schach is good and there's enough schach? You make that judgment call when, as if it's in one plane. That's how you perceive it. As long as it would be still some mechanta. Under those conditions, then it's still a good sukkah, even though right now the sun's shining in. Tosfos disagrees with Rashi, and Tosfos says that you always look at it as if the sun is directly overhead, and therefore it doesn't matter if there's different layers. And the psul is not here. Al tilsa mechanta. It's just a question of whether or not the 2 layers of schach can combine to become one layer. Since we have the pictures in the back of the Gemara, I'm going to take advantage of that and show you the nice picture that they show here. So this is the Sukkah Miduvlalas, where there's a layer of schach on top and on the bottom. So they're offset as if you would bring them down, you bring the upper lower down to the lower layer, it would create one nice plane of schach. Okay. So let's see. By turn the Gemara. Zok Tehillim Gemara. Rav Tani Chada. Rav learns that it's all one case. In other words, it's a sukkah that doesn't have enough schach in certain areas, but the sum total of it all is still some rub mechanta. Therefore, it's still kosher. Shmuel Tani Tarki. According to Shmuel, it's 2 separate cases. There's one case where you have the 2 layers of schach that are offset from one another. And the other case is any sukkah that has enough shade is going to be kosher. You might ask, why does the Mishnah need to repeat it? We already know Cham Tamru Mitzilta is a problem. So the Gemara is going to elaborate on that. Rav Tani Chada Sukkah Miduvlalas. He calls it a Sukkah Miduvlalas. How does that relate to a sukkah that doesn't have enough schach? My Miduvlalas, Midul Delas, like a dal, like a pore. It's a poor sukkah because it's very sparsely covered. But if it meets the minimum requirement of shetzilsa merub mechamta, shera, it will still be kosher. Shmuel Tani Tarti. Shmuel says there's two independent cases in our Mishnah. Mahmud of Lela says mibul velas, mixed up, meaning every 6 inches the schach changes the height. There's 6 inches of schach right above the sukkah, and then the next 6 inches is offset and it's in a higher plane. V'tarti katani, and therefore the tzilsa merub mechamta in the Mishnah has nothing to do with the earlier case, and it's just another halacha that a sukkah that has tzilsa merub mechamta is kosher. Zok to Gemara, katani sukkah mibul belas kshera, vishet tzilsa merub mechamta kshera. I'm sorry, so that's the two halachas in the Mishnah. Rabbi, loy shonu, this, that, the way Shmuel understood the Mishnah, if you have the layers of schach are offset from each other, that is kosher. That's only if there's a maximum of 3 tfachim of height in between the layers, because we know up to 3 tfachim you say lavud, and you look at it as if it's one layer. But if there's 3 tfachim in between the 2 layers of schach, then psula, then it's going to be possible because you don't say lavud. Even if the layers of schach are 3 tvachim or more, nami le'amran, we still don't say that they don't combine, and it's possible. That's only if the upper layer is not, each piece of the upper layer is not at least 1 tefach wide. But if each of the pieces on top are a full tefach, then kshera, then it will be kosher even if the upper layer is more than 3 tefachim above the lower layer. The Amrin Chavoit Rami. So Chavoit Rami is a new principle. You say that you look at it, you bring it down. You have this 1 tefach roof that's higher up, and you just bring it down to be in the same plane as the lower level of schach. So let's see what this Chavoit Rami is. So I'm going to look in Rashi that Dibra Masel She'ein Begagon. So it's a little bit lower, maybe an inch lower, a half inch lower than where we are in the Gemara. And it's Rashi says She'ein Begagon. Bekana ha'oila roichav tefa. Each of the strips, each of the pieces that are in the upper level, we only say that they have to be within 3 tefachim of the lower level if each piece is not a tefach wide. What's the significance of a tefach? The lav shem oil alay. Once it's a tefach wide, it has the status of an oil. Lachshuve, to give it a chashivas, ulememer bei chavoit rami. Once it's a tefach wide and it's already classified as an oil, then you say chavoit rami, which means hashbel, lower it, and look at it as if it's covering the airspace that's below it, the airspace that's between each of the pieces of schach on the lower level. Where does this chavoit rami come from? What is it? Zok Rashi, this is another version of good achas. The hainu nami inyan good achas. It's like a wall that doesn't come all the way down to the floor, that we create an imaginary wall that reaches the floor, good achas. However, Zok Rashi, when you're talking about something that's a vertical plane, like a wall, where we're only moving the edge of the mechita down, good achas. You use the lashon of good achas, meaning you just pull it down to the floor. Well, let me just finish Rashi. But if you have something that's in a horizontal plane and you want to bring it down to cover a hole, there shaykh. So Rashi seems to say that chavoit rami is the horizontal version of good achas. Let me just see the next Rashi. Chavoit rami, even if it's more than 3 tefachim above the lower level, you still look at it like this oil comes down to cover up the open air spaces. If we're only speaking about a second layer that's less than 3 tefachim above the lower level, lav chavoitu, you don't have to come on to chavoit. Sharehu kamush kavala. We're not imaginary bringing it down. We said lavud means you always perceive it as if it's in one, if it's connected, as if it's in one plane, if it was within 3 tvachim. Sorry?
Now you brought up something good enough. We're still talking about the width, not the height.
Correct.
If you have the height, then that would also.
No, we're talking about the width. Because then you could say pitikri.
Right.
No, we're talking about its thickness. If its thickness is a tefach and it consists of an oil, then we could move the plane of that oil to the level of where the opening is. Okay, gewaltig. So Rava told us a chiddush. That you have a concept of chavoit rami, and the concept of chavoit rami only works on a horizontal plane that's at least a tefach wide. Amr Rava. Rava said, "Mina amin Allah." Where did I get this from? That the chi is pei tefach amrin chavoit rami, the chi less pei lo amrin chavoit rami. Where did I get this from? Oh, before I go by there, I forgot to say over a very interesting lesson that Rabbi Yashiv taught us relevant to yesterday's Gemara. Yesterday we learned about how makbid they were in preparing the paraduma, right? So Rabbi Yashiv said over, it's a random thing. About 5 years ago, there was a whole tumult of the Vels that they had found, I think somewhere in New Jersey, a farmer that had a paraduma born to him. And there was a big sensation. Mashiach's coming to paraduma. Yeah, Kubi, he wanted to show it him. So the Rabbi Yasha says, don't get so excited. Not a sign of Mashiach, and I'll prove it to you. Because the paraduma, before it can be processed, has to be 2 years old. This one was just born. We say, so we have to believe Mashiach come tomorrow. So therefore, it can't be this paraduma that we're laying our bets on, because we believe the Mashiach would come today, which means there was already a paraduma that's already 2 years old. That's just an aside. There's nothing to do with this Gemara or that Gemara, but it was interesting. Yeah, but for now, don't be so excited about Mashiach, because this is not a sign of Mashiach coming now. It would have been a paraduma that was found already, or that you might find in the future that's already 2 years old. Okay, so let's see what it says. So Rava says that this concept of Chavroit Rami, which means you could adjust the height of any horizontal plane, you only say that if the horizontal plane that you're adjusting its height is at least a tefach wide, which meets the minimum requirements of an oil. So where did we get this from? So now we're talking about Hilchas Tumah. We know that whenever there's Tumah underneath an oil, the Tumah spreads to the entire area beneath the oil. And it will not pass through, it will not penetrate the oil. However, if you don't have an oil, then any tumah underneath, whatever that plane is, but it's not a tefach wide, the tumah will not spread underneath it, but the tumah will pierce right through it up to Shemai. So the Tan we learned as follows. Now, the way you build any floor is first you put floor joists, and then you put subflooring on top of the floor joists. So imagine you've roughed your middle of doing the framing of a two-story home, and you've already put the floor joists out, and you've already put the ceiling joists out. So it's a two-story building. So there's the floor joists, which are between which are the ceiling of the first floor or the floor of the second floor. Those are the floor joists of the second floor, and then you do the ceiling joists of the second floor. They're not finished yet, so they're not waterproof. Rashi says not only are they not waterproof, they don't have a subfloor either. You just have the individual beams going across that will support the floor joists. I'm sorry, that will support the subflooring when it's put down. They built it so that the individual floor joists for the floor of the second level are directly below the ceiling joists of the second level. So one is directly below the other. Tuma tachas achas man. Now we're assuming that the thickness of each floor joist is at least a tefach wide, and therefore underneath it there would be an oil. So you have two sets of oilim. In other words, two sets of floor joists at the floor of the second level and at the ceiling of the second level. So tuma tachas achas mehen. What if there's tuma underneath the floor joist of the second floor, which would mean on the ground level? You had tuma on the ground level that was right below one of the floor joists of the second floor. So that floor joist now makes an oil over that tuma that's there. So tuma tachas achas mehen, tachtei atami. Everything underneath that floor joist, everything on the main level that's underneath that floor joist will be tummy because it's in oil. How about ben atachtonya l'elyon? What if it was on top of the floor joist of the second level, which was right below, directly below the corresponding ceiling joist of the second level that's right above it? So now it's in an oil, but the top of the oil is now the top of the second floor, and the bottom of the oil is the floor of the second floor. So Beinei and Tameh, all of the space in this tefach will be Tameh. Anything that's found in it will be considered to having been found in the oil ames. But al gabe hel yoina, period. Al gabe hel yoina. What if you found a kazayis from a mace on top of the ceiling joist? So then we say kenegda adler rakia tameh. Then the tumah goes all the way up to the sky because there's nothing above it, but it won't go below because below is also a tefach, which is the roof of an oil, and therefore tumah will not penetrate down, but tumah will go straight up. That's if they line up perfectly, that the floor joists of the second floor were directly below the ceiling joists of the second floor. But what if they were opposite? What if if the upper joists were situated offset and they were directly in between the tachtonos? So now let's see how that plays out. Tuma tachtehen. You have a tuma on the main level. Tachas kulan tame. We look at it like it's one big roof, and therefore underneath the entire roof will be tame. So now we look at it like the upper level joists are down, filling the space in between the lower level joists, because that's where they're situated. And therefore, if you have a size from a mace that's on the main level, everything on the main level becomes tummy because it's one big oil. So again, if the joists were offset such that the gaps in between the floor joists of the second floor were covered directly with the joists of the ceiling of the second floor. So tuma tachtein tachas kulan tamim. If there's tuma underneath any one of these joists, we look at it like it's one big ceiling and one big oil. Tuma al gabein. What if you have tuma on top of one of these joists? Then keneg the adler ki tame. Anything above will be tame. Anything below will be protected from the oil. Betani Allah. And we learned a brisa that adds explanation and clarity to what we just learned. And this is what it says. We say this only if the floor joists of the second level were each a tefach wide, and the space that's in between each floor joist of the second level is a tefach wide, and by extension, the upper level, the floor joist or the ceiling joist of the second level were big enough to fill that space, which means they were also a tefach wide. But if there is no space in between the floor joist of the second level of a tefach, and therefore by extension, the width of the beams on the second level were not a tefach because they're designed to fill in that space, then tuma tachas achas mehen. If there's a tuma underneath one of them, tachtei tame, underneath it's tame, which means if there's a tuma on the main level underneath one of the floor joists of the second floor, which is a tefach wide, then tachtei tame underneath that floor joist, which is an oil, because the floor joists at the second level are a tefach wide. Anything underneath them will be tamei, but beinei and valgabeim tar, in between the floor joists of the second floor or above them will be tahar because they're not underneath that oil. So you see very clearly that you only say chavayit rami, you only look at it like it's one big plane if the upper level, if each joist of the upper level is at least a tefach wide. But if not, you don't say chavayit rami. Alma, you see very clearly from here. He is be tefach amrina and chavayit rami. When do you say that you lower the plane of the upper roof to fill the space in between each of the joists of the lower roof? Is only if they're a tefach wide. The chiles be tefach, but if they're not a tefach wide, so therefore, the same thing that classifies something as an oil for tumah, so the same conditions under which we would say chavayit rami. In tumah, under those same conditions, only do we say chavayit rami for sukkah, and that's only if each piece is at least a tefach wide. That's the conclusion of Rava. And now the Gemara wants to ask a kash on Rava and wants to prove that you say chavayit rami even if each piece is less than a tefach wide. Yosy Rav Kahana the Ka'amar Lo Shmait. Rav Kahana was sharing over this halacha that Rava said that you say chavayit rami no matter how far apart the layers are, as long as the upper layer that you want to lower is at least a tefach wide. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana. So Rav Ashi told Rav Kahana, the less betefach, are you going to claim that if the oil, the board is not a tefach wide, you don't say chavayit rami? I'm going to prove to you that you say chavayit rami regardless. And the Gemara reaches out to a case of mavli and to a familiar case that we had. We know that in order to allow people to carry in a mavli, there has to be a sign that demarcates where the Rishus HaRabim begins when you're leaving the mavli. And they used to do it, one of the ways they did it was with a kaira, which would be a beam that runs across the opening between the mavli and the Rishus HaRabim. So we had halachas about this kaira. So let's see what we learned here. Kaira hayotze b'koisel zeh, ve'ein nagas b'koisel zeh. We had this brisa through Bladagoy. If you have a beam, let's say the opening of the mavli is 20 feet, and your beam is just 20 feet. It can't be suspended in midair in between the two walls, so clearly you have to have it lean over one wall by a couple of feet, and you could fasten it down really well, and then it'll cantilever over, but it won't quite make it all the way to rest on the opposite wall of the mavli. Or, v'chein shnei kairos, achas yosy b'koisel zeh, v'achas yosy b'koisel zeh. Or if you have two beams, because you don't have one beam that's long enough, you start one on the left side, one on the right side, and they come together in the middle, but they don't quite touch each other. If they're within 3 tefachim of each other, you don't bring another kaira. We say it's good because we always know within 3 tefachim you say lavud. And if you remember, this was brought relevant to the shaila of whether or not you say lavud be'emta. You only say lavud between the horizontal plane of the roof and the wall, or do you also say lavud in the middle of a span? And the Gemara brought a raya from here that you say lavud in the middle of a span. But shloisha, if there is a gap of 3 tvachim, then tzarech lahavi kair acheres. Then you would have to find a beam that's long enough to go all the way across. That lavud you say up to 4 tvachim. Pachus me'arba, even if there's a gap of more than 3 tvachim, but less than 4 tvachim, ein tzarech lahavi kair acheres. You wouldn't need to bring another beam, but arba. But if it was a full 4 tvachim in between these two kairos, so between the kair and the wall, then tzarech lahavi kair acheres. Then you have to bring a longer kair. So that's if the kair was not long enough to span the gap. But what if you had a kair that was long enough to span the gap, but the kair itself was too thin to meet the minimum requirements of what a kair has to be? Then we're going to soon learn that there is a minimum requirement of what the kair has to be. And let's see Rashi, the first Rashi on the Stay Kairos HaMasimos. It's non be'ervin. We learned in Ervin, HaKairos Sha'amru, the beam that we said that you use as a sign that this is the demarcation point. So you run it right across the opening. It has to be Rachva L'Kabel Ariach. It has to be wide enough to carry an Ariach. What is an Ariach? The Ariach Chatzi Levena so Shlosh Tvachim. If you have a block that's 3 Tvachim by 3 Tvachim, that's called a Levena. If you split it in half, then you're 1.5 Tvachim by 3 Tvachim, and that's what an Ariach is. It's a block that's 1.5 Tvachim by 3 Tvachim. So how thick does this beam have to be? Daya L'Kaira Shitei Rachva Tefach. The Kaira only has to be 1 Tefach wide. Why is that? Because then an Ariach could sit on the floor. Meaning, a Tefach beam is the perfect surface to place a stone that's a Tefach and a half wide. Correct the Gemara, if you're putting a block that's a Tefach and a half, wouldn't it be logical that the beam supporting it should also be a Tefach and a half? Mishani, the Gemara answered in Erevin, the beam that holds up the block can be slightly smaller than the block. It could be a half a tefach smaller, which would mean if you place the block on it on center, it would hang over a quarter of a tefach on either side, which is the thickness of a finger. So this way, a finger it hangs over the cutter on one side, a finger on the other side, and right on the cutter is supported the tefach core of this block. And then you malavna betina, and then of course you would cement it in so it doesn't shift off. Zok Rashi. What if you didn't have one beam that was a tefach thick? Instead, you took 2 beams. Each beam was a half a tefach, and you put them together. Similar to in our construction, sometimes they create a beam out of a series of 2x4s or 2x10s, and they nail them together. And you could have sometimes 4 or even 6 2x10s nailed together to act as single joints. The Hainu Masimos came to them. They're like twin together. So that's what the Gemara means, or the Brisa means, when it says on the 3rd line of Chav Beis, if you have twin kairos, because you didn't have one kairos that was thick enough, each beam alone is not a tefach thick, but together they're tefach. If combined, they could still hold a tefach. That is still good. But even when you combine multiple beams together, they're so thin that they still don't make up a tefach. Then you'd have to bring another beam. If they could support a 3 tefach block, then ein tzarich lavi koyer acheres. Then it doesn't have to. Then the koyer is good. Now this, at first glance, seems like a chumrah. Shimon Gamliel is saying a koyer of a tefach is not big enough. It's got to be a koyer of 3 tefach. But in fact, that's not what it is. Shimon Gamliel is trying to offer us an additional option, and he's being makel. And what does he mean? So let's see Rashi. Shimon ben Gamliel Omer in the Kabbalah Shariach LaOrcha Shloisha Ein Tzarich Lavi Koyer Acheres. With Rashi, Shimon ben Gamliel LaHakelba. He's actually being makel because he's offering an alternative. And what does he say? Even if you don't have the thickness of a tefach, your beam is less than the thickness of a tefach, and you have 2 beams, and even combined, it's less than a tefach. So he said what you could do is, you don't have to place the 2 beams right up against each other. You could set them up where there's a gap in between them. Even if combined, they don't make up a tefach. But you can spread them apart enough. You have these 2 beams that are each much less than a tefach, and they're more than a tefach is a half apart. If they're more than a tefach and a half apart, if you tried putting this ariach that's only a tefach and a half, it's going to fall down in between them. But if you turn the block the other way, where now it's a length of 3 tefachim, and then it'll rest on those two beams, that'll still work. You can spread apart these two beams to just under 3 tefachim, and then you could take the brick and turn it so that its length of 3 tefachim spans across the two blocks, the two beams. Even that would still be acceptable. There's only one condition to that. That's only if these beams can actually support the weight of a block that's 3 tefachim long. If they're not strong enough to support these blocks, so let's have a look at the picture again, because in the picture book, he actually provides very nice graphics of this. So these pictures here this is the coir that's not quite long enough to span the gap. This was the 2 coirs that actually did span that also was not, each one is not long enough to span the gap combined, so there's space in between them. Here are the 2 that are achatzi tefach, that are together, that are good. You're allowed to put 2 together. And this is when the 2 together do not combine to a tefach. Now let's look at the case that we're talking about, where they're further apart, but you could still support a brick with it. So this is the ariach, which is the half a levena. So it's a tefach and a half by 3 tefachim. And this picture here is what we're looking at. Is we have 2 beams, and together they don't make up a tefach. But if you spread them apart, they'll be able to support the block of 3 tefachim. You can see the block of 3 tefachim is put with its length spanning across the 2 beams, and they're perfectly distant from each other to perfectly support this block that's 3 tefachim. So Shimon Gamliel says this would also be acceptable. However, what happens if you have these 2 beams that we're trying to span this block across? What if what if these 2 beams were not on the same plane? So you can't physically put the block on it, because you need to have the 2 coirs on the same plane so that you can rest the stone on it. But now we have a case where these 2 beams are on different planes. One's higher than the other. So Rabbi Yosy bar Yehuda says we still have a solution, because royin ha'el yoina ki'ilu hi lemata v'sachtoina ki'ilu lemayla. We say chavayt rami. We make believe like they're on the same plane. Uvilvad shaloi te'el yoina lemayla me'asher. As long as the el yoina wasn't above 20 amas, because we know that a koira above 20 amas is not good. And v'tachtoina lemata me'asara. And the lower one can't be less than 10 tefachim, because again, a koira, it's less than 10 tefachim of height, doesn't work either. But if both of these 2 beams, even if they're not on the same plane, but they're within 20 amas of height to 10 amas of height, they're in that safe zone, you would make believe they're both on the same plane. Even though we made it clear, Shimon Gamliel says that even if between the 2 of them there's no tefach, as long as they could line up to support a block, they'll be kosher. So here you have 2 beams that are each less than a tefach, and we're adjusting their height to bring them into the same plane through chavayt rami. So this is a contradiction to Rava, who said that you only say chavayt rami on a board that could be an oil that's at least a tefach wide. Amalei, so Rava said, no problem. I can explain that case differently. They have to be within 3 tefachim of each other. That's not using chavayt rami, because in fact it's not a tefach wide. So it's not based on the principle of chavayt rami. It's based on lavud, where they're within 3 tefachim of each other. It seems from the text of the brisa that one could be right below 20 amas, and one could be right above 10 tefachim, which means they're very far apart. They're way more than 3 tefachim apart. Dr. Rava, let me tell you how you're supposed to read that price. The upper one shouldn't be above 20. The upper beam has to be less than 20 amis from the floor. And the other beam that you want to make believe is on the same plane has to be smuchala b'pachas mishloisha. It does have to be within 3 tvachim, and then you say lovut. But in fact, you don't say chavayt rami in such a situation because it's not a tefach thick. You only say lovut. Inami or the lower beam cannot be less than 10 tvachim high because it's not good. It has to be l'mayla me'asar. But the alyoina, the upper beam that you want to bring down and put into the same plane as the lower beam, has to be smuchala b'pachas mishlosh. Has to be within 3 tvachim, where you could still say lavud al shloisha, but if they're more than 3 tvachim apart, give it the less pay tefach. Since they don't have the thickness of a tefach, loy amrinon chavayt rami, we will not say the halacha of chavayt rami. So once again, you don't have a raya that you say chavayt rami, even if it's less than a tefach. You only say chavayt rami if the thickness of the beam is a full tefach. Okay, now we're going to get into an interesting sugya about how thick it has to be. If you have schach that's more tzeil than chama, it's kosher. If there has to be more shade than schach, that means you're saying that if it was exactly 50-50, it would be possible. But we learned earlier that if it has more sun than shade, then it's possible. If it was exactly 50-50, share would be kosher. So we have a stira. The earlier Mishnah says 50-50 is kosher. Our Mishnah says 50-50 is not kosher. You have to be 51% sale. So not only is our Mishnah, you can't ask a kash on our Mishnah, what's the chiddush? We already said it, because this is actually contradictory to what the first Mishnah said. Dr. Morloy Kash, it's not fair. They both mean the same thing. The question is where you're looking. Kan milamayla, kan milamata. And Pashim Pshat Rashi is milamayla. If it's 50-50, it won't work, because if it's 50 schach and 50 air, when you look down at the bottom, the way the sunlight spreads, the rays spread. If you only have 50% of the sukkah covered, when you look down at the floor, you'll see that the shadow will be less than 50% because the rays extend. It's not like a laser where it just comes straight through. If there's sun shining through, it'll spread. Therefore, you need to have more schach than sail, more schach than chama, that is, more schach than airspace. And that will lead to you having at least 50% of the floor in shade. And kan milamata, when the Mishnah earlier said that 50-50 is enough, that's looking on the floor at the shade pattern. Rapapa said, that's what people say. The saying is, it should be the small opening above will allow through enough sunlight that it'll look like a big coin on the floor. This is how Rashi learns. So since when the sun comes through a narrower space, the rays spread out and creates a lot more sun on the floor, there's a much bigger footprint, so to speak, of sun. Therefore, you have to have roiv the sukkah covered, and this way you'll have at least 50% sail on the bottom. Very thick schach. What is the halacha with very thick schach? Even though you can't see the stars, share it will still be kosher. But how about how about if there's absolutely no sunlight that penetrates the schach? If it's ein koich vechama niron mitoicha, then the shamay poisel will be so machshir. The shamay also will be possible, and the still also will be kosher. There's a lot of Torah about this, because we paskin that you're supposed to be able to see the stars, but we learn that it doesn't mean wherever you look you have to be able to see the stars. There has to be one place in the sukkah where if you analyze it and look through it carefully, you'll see a star. But there's also the Shita of the Rebbeinu Tam, who holds that it has to be not waterproof. If rain can't get through in the sukkah, the Rebbeinu Tam holds it's a chesaron in the dearest kfa. It's not considered. It's like a tikra almost. So Rebbeinu Tam says it has to be able to be penetrated by rain. So that takes us to a big shiloh they had. Someone invented something called the mutar mat, and what it was is it was a series of bamboos that were cut in half lengthwise. So each bamboo was like a half a pipe, and they had a lower layer of half a pipes with the opening facing up, and then they had an upper layer of the half a pipes with the backside facing up that straddled two channels. So what would happen is rain would come, light to get through, because it was a light mat. But the way it was designed is that when it rained, the upper channel, being upside down, would channel the water to either side into the center of the lower channels, which acted as like an eaves, and then it would run out from the eaves. And there was a waterproof mat. And there was a big controversy, and I put on our WhatsApp group a whole discussion in the 5 towns, Jewish Times, a whole discussion as to whether or not this type of schach would be tar. It would be good. Most poskim held that it was good, because even if it was keeping out the rain, it still wouldn't be exeris tikra, and it still wouldn't look kavua. And even according to Rebbeinu Tam, most of them felt that it was good because this isn't too thick. So in 2015, so 6 years ago, the mutar mat hit the market, and they claimed that who held it was good. Chaim Kanievsky held it was good. The Dayan from the Edechredes, Yaakov Fisher said it was good. Rabbi Orbach said it was good. Rabbi Yasher said it was good. Rabbi Zilbershin said it was good. Rabbi Kluger said it was good. Rabbi Leo Levine said it's good. Rabbi Moshe Royd, the Badas of Lakewood, everyone said it was good. And they had the endorsements of all these people on their packaging, on the advertisement. However, and this was made by a Yid from Belgium, Yid Hach from Belgium made it, and he had the brand name of Schach Apella, because it was remarkable that it held it up. So he brings down that a lot of people didn't hold of it, and Reb Chaim Kreisworth of Antwerp was matter. He said it's kosher, but most of the poskim didn't allow it. And it was all about a schach that's so thick, water can't penetrate it, and that type of schach, the Rebbeinu Tam says it's not good. So we bring down for the Rosh, the Tur, and the Rebbeinu Tam, all held that schach that's so thick is not kosher. But the Mechaber says unless it's Xeris Kair, unless it's Xeris Tikra and they're 4 Tvachim wide, there shouldn't be a problem. So there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not this mat was good. And Mayor Brandsdorfer, he was the main person who came out against them, because he held that if you have a rainproof schach, it resembles a house, and therefore it'll be Xeris Tikra. So that was the whole shiloh. That was the whole shiloh. It was a very big shiloh. I don't think the item uses it. I never saw anyone using it. But it was a sensation when it hit the market. But at the end of the day, many poskim held that it wouldn't be consistent with Rebbeinu Tam's Akpada, that the sukkah has to be penetrable by rain. Okay, let's see the Gemara about it. What if you make a sukkah on a wagon? And Rashi tells us that even though it's not a kaviyas like a sukkah, it moves around, it's mobile, this is a sukkah mobile. Or on top of a ship. And what's the problem with that? It is kosher. Rashi says the problem with the svina is shumakain goyveshal svina. It's not on the lower deck; it's on the upper deck, which would vayam. It's going to be way above sea level. You could be pretty high up on the deck of a ship. It's quite high, and therefore it's above the surrounding terrain, even the surrounding highlands, which means it's susceptible to unbridled winds, because there's no mountains or buildings around when you're on the high seas that protect you from the wind. And therefore, it's much more susceptible to being blown over by the wind. Nevertheless, it's kosher. Rashi says the diras arai sagibe, because a diras arai is acceptable for a sukkah.
Not saying necessarily over suffering. That's what it's coming out. Being on a ship.
Being on the ship is automatically, not you built it tall. Being on the ship, it's automatically taller than the area around it.
But it can still be within 20 amas.
Of its own floor, of course. Even if it's above 20 amas, it's irrelevant. The 20 amma rule is from your floor of your sukkah to the top of your sukkah.
No, the issue here is that it's in a place that seems to be very windy.
That's right.
Not the height.
Correct. That's right. And we had Mandomar, a Tana who held these weren't kosher, but this Tana holds they are kosher. And Va'in Labi Yom Tov. There's nothing wrong with going in and out of them on Yom Tov. There's no chiddush in this. Where Rashi tells us we're just trying to contrast it with the next.
What's the critical decision? Say if you put it in a plane that's windy.
If you put it in a very windy place, and right, so because I guess the most typical example in those days,
the ship is inherently.
They didn't have Chicago in those days. Okay, so what about Beroisha Ilam? What if you built a sukkah as a treehouse, or al gabe gomel, or on top of a camel? Share it. That's also a kosher sukkah. But the problem is, you're not allowed to be mishtamish with an Elon. You're not allowed to climb onto a tree on Yom Tov. And therefore, Rashi says, the Gozer Barabana. The Rabbanan say, you're not allowed to climb onto a tree because you might break off a branch. So it's a kosher sukkah, but you can't use it on Yom Tov, only a cholamoid. How about Shtayim Be'ilan Ba'achas B'diyad? You didn't completely build the treehouse, the sukkah in the tree. Rather, you built one wall that started from the ground. It went up to the floor of the sukkah and supported one side of the sukkah, and then continued up to act as the wall of that sukkah. But the other walls, the other rest of the floor of the sukkah, was supported by the tree. The Stein Bil Bachs B'Adam, it was primarily resting on the tree, but one leg out of three was being held up by a proper kosher floor. Or even if most of the support was on something that was done by the Adam, which there wouldn't be a restriction of climbing up on Yom Tov. But it was still leaning enough that it would fall down if it wasn't for the tree. Share their kosher, but the Ein Idol Labi Yom Tov, once again, you have the restriction of you're not allowed to climb up on a tree on Yom Tov. What about Shalish for the Adam Bachas Bilam? What if 3 sides of the sukkah is supported by something that you could use on Shabbos, and only the 4th wall, which you don't even need, is leaning on the sukkah? That's Ksher V'Ayin Labi Yom Tov. There you could even use it on Yom Tov. Why? Zaklal. If you could remove the tree and the sukkah will still remain standing, Sheira, it would be kosher, and you're allowed to use it on Yom Tov. So let's stop here. Misham, tomorrow I'm not going to be here, but I'll be on Zoom for both 6 and 9. Shabbos, I will not be here, but we'll learn much of Shabbos at 10:30. And Sunday, we'll learn the normal time, 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. And the same thing will be with Monday. We'll learn 7 and 9 because Monday is a long weekend. The only thing is I'm going to need somebody to host the Zoom because I'm just going to call in because I'm going to be traveling then. So I'll call in and we'll get somebody to host. I'll figure it out. Someone who can do that. Okay. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos.
Yeah.
Shkoyach.
Yeah.